So you want the details on my so-called family life? Here goes. I'm Emma, hitting the big 3-0 this year, and I've been with Mike, my other half, since we were both too young to know any better. He's a catch, that's for sure. A hard worker, kind-hearted, and looks that don't hurt the eyes, if you get what I mean. The first time I walked into Mike's mom's house, I remember thinking it was like walking into one of those TV shows where everything's for sale. There she was, Linda, parked on her couch with a phone in one hand and a credit card in the other. She was chatting away with some customer service rep like they were old pals. "Another set of fancy plates, Linda?" Mike had teased, nudging me as we walked in. "You planning to open a restaurant or something?" Linda had flashed a grin, all teeth. "Oh, Mike, you can never have too many. What if the queen comes for tea?" She had laughed, her eyes never leaving the screen. I laughed along, trying to find my place in this new scene. "Nice to finally meet you, Mrs. B," I managed, extending a hand that got swallowed in a tangle of bracelets and bargain buys. "Call me Linda, dear," she said, eyes sizing me up like I was the next item on the Home Shopping Network. "So you're the girl who's stolen my boy's heart. Sit. Tell me everything." And that was my introduction to the den where our bank account would take hit after hit. Because Linda, as I'd come to find out, was more than just a spontaneous shopper. She was a black hole for cash. Her mania for shop-on-the-couch deals was just the tip of the iceberg. Mike had told me stories about his parents leaving her a nice nest egg, but by the time I got in the picture, that egg had been cracked and scrambled on a slew of knickknacks and one-of-a-kind finds that filled every corner of her house. Sitting down for dinner that night, Mike threw an arm around my shoulder, whispering, "Thanks for being cool about Mom. She's, well, you know." I had smiled, tight-lipped. Yeah, she's something, all right. It was only after we said our goodbyes that Mike let out a sigh, heavy like he was carrying a boulder. "She's going through the inheritance faster than I thought," he admitted as we drove away. "I'm kinda worried." Little did I know, his worry would soon become our financial sinkhole. But that's a story for another chapter, isn't it? Things started getting real when Linda came to us with her hands out, saying she was short on money. At first, it was here and there, a few $100 to cover the electric bill or groceries. Mike and I, we were doing okay for ourselves, so helping out didn't seem like a big deal. But soon, it turned into a monthly ritual. It was a lazy Sunday morning when the topic first came up. Mike was making pancakes, a little ritual of his own, when he said, "Babe, I think we should help Mom out with a regular thing. You know, just until she gets on her feet." I remember pausing, a mug halfway to my lips. "Regular? Like an allowance?" "Yeah." Mike had flipped a pancake, a little frown creasing his forehead. She's struggling." The figure we landed on? $2,000. Every month. I still remember the knot in my stomach when we agreed on that number. It wasn't that we couldn't afford it. It just felt like stepping onto a slippery slope. The first time we handed over the cash, Linda had tears in her eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without you two," she had said, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. "It's no problem, Linda," I had said, trying to sound cheerful. "You'd do the same for us, right?" She had nodded, whipping her eyes. "Of course, darling. Family helps family." But then the next month rolled around, and the next. The envelope of cash was part of our budget, a line item that read, "Linda's Lifeline." Mike never said much about it, but I caught the worried looks he shot our bank statements after each donation to the cause. One night, after we'd handed over the latest installment, I found Mike sitting in the dark, staring at nothing. "Everything okay?" I had asked, flicking on the light. He'd blinked, slow, then nodded. "Yeah, just thinking. You know we're doing a good thing, right?" I had sat down next to him, bumping his shoulder with mine. "Yeah, I know. But does she have to spend it all on shopping? Mike had rubbed a hand over his face. I don't know. I hope she's actually buying stuff she needs. Hope, I'd learned, wasn't the same as reality. And reality was about to give us a wake-up call. It didn't take long for the $2,000 to start feeling like chump change to Linda. I could tell something was up when she stopped thanking us. The gratitude was replaced by expectations, and soon, demands. One evening, Mike's phone buzzed, and I saw him tense up before he even answered. Linda's name flashed on the screen. Hey, Mom. What's up? Mike's voice was wary, guarded. I only caught one side of the conversation, but that was enough. There was a pause, and then Mike's face said it all. Furrowed brow, tight lips. Mom, we talked about this. No, I know, but... Linda must have cut him off because he went silent, just listening, his hand clenching around the phone. When he finally spoke again, his voice had that forced calm you use with kids throwing a fit. We can't do that right now. We've already given you the money for this month. Another pause. Then Mike's hand went to his forehead. It's not about not wanting to, it's just... Whatever Linda said next made Mike pull the phone away from his ear for a second. He took a deep breath, and when he put the phone back, his voice was firmer. Mom, stop. We can't. That's final. He ended the call, and the room was thick with tension. Mike looked at me, his eyes apologetic. That was intense, I ventured, my stomach twisting. Mike sighed and set his phone down with a kind of resignation. She wanted another $1,000. Said she saw a set of designer curtains that would change her life. I snorted before I could help it. Curtains? Really? Mike didn't smile. She said we don't care about her, that we're just leaving her to struggle. I reached over and took his hand. We're not, and you know it. She's using you, Mike. He squeezed my hand, but his gaze drifted off, lost. I just don't know how to make her stop. The calls didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. Linda started ringing at odd hours, sometimes even past midnight, as if she'd forgotten the decency of time zones. Once, she called during a work meeting, and Mike had to step out, his face a mask of embarrassment. The peak of it all was the day Linda showed up unannounced, wailing outside our front door about how we were terrible children for not supporting her, for leaving her destitute. Our neighbors peered out their windows as Linda's voice hit pitches I didn't know existed. We're not doing this here, Mom, Mike had said, stepping outside, closing the door behind him to spare me the worst of it. I sat on our couch, hands over my ears, listening to the muffled sounds of a tantrum that should have been left behind in childhood. This was no longer about need, it was about want, and the wants were endless. Mike knew it. I knew it. And deep down, I think even Linda knew it. But knowing something's broken and fixing it are two different things. Mike wasn't ready to fix it. Not yet. And so the tantrums became another part of our routine, another thing to anticipate and dread. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only going to get worse. As the months dragged on, the weight of Linda's demands started taking a toll on our marriage. Mike had always been the kind of guy who could roll with the punches, but even he had limits. He was caught in the middle, wanting to please his mom and keep the peace at home. One quiet evening, I found him in the garage, staring at an old photo of him and his mom. He didn't hear me come in. Hey, I said, keeping my voice gentle. He looked up, a bit startled. Hey, I was just thinking. I leaned against the workbench. About? He put the photo down and rubbed his face. About all this stuff with Mom. It's like she's a different person. I walked over to him. It's okay to say no to her, you know. He shook his head. You don't get it. She raised me by herself. She's all I have. But what about us, Mike? What about what we need? It was a plea more than a question. I know. I know, he said, the lines in his forehead deepening. It's just not easy. We stood there for a moment, the distance between us filled with unspoken words. Maybe we can talk to someone, get some advice, I suggested. He looked at me like a man drowning, grasping for a lifeline. Yeah, maybe. The talk ended up being more of a venting session, with Mike pacing around our kitchen, phone in hand, looking for financial advisors, family therapists, anyone who could give us a roadmap through this mess. Emma, she's my mom, but I feel like I'm paying for love, you know? Mike confessed to me one night as we sat at the dinner table, not touching our food. I reached across the table and took his hand. I think she loves you, in her way. But she's taking advantage of you, and that's not love. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, what if she ends up with nothing because I didn't help? The fear in his voice broke my heart a little. What if we end up with nothing because you helped too much? Mike was trapped in his own head, fighting a battle where every choice seemed wrong. And I was trapped with him, watching the man I loved get twisted up inside, unsure of how to free himself from the ties that bound him so tightly to his mother. I knew then that something had to give. We couldn't go on like this. But for Mike to see that, for him to really understand, it was going to take something big, something that would shake him enough to break the hold Linda had over him. I just didn't know what that something was yet. The final straw came when Linda called to demand money for a luxury cruise. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience, Mike, she insisted over the speakerphone. Your dad would have wanted me to enjoy life. Mike glanced at me, his face pale. Mom, we've got our own bills. We can't do this right now. But I'm your mother, Linda's voice crackled with indignation. You owe me this much. Mike's hand was shaking as he held the phone. It's not about owing, Mom. I couldn't take it anymore. Linda, you can't keep doing this, I interjected, my voice surprisingly steady. It's not fair to Mike. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. And who are you to tell me what's fair? You just married into this family. I'm his mother. I felt Mike's hand on my arm, but I shook it off. Being his mother doesn't give you the right to drain our finances. Linda was seething now. I see how it is. You've turned my son against me. That's not true, Mike cut in, but his voice lacked conviction. It is true, Linda was almost shouting. And if you two don't want to help me, maybe I should just talk to a lawyer about what I'm owed. We both stared at the phone in disbelief. You would sue your own son? Mike's voice was a whisper. If I have to, Linda shot back. I'll call you tomorrow. You better have a good answer. The call ended with a click, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Mike looked at me, his eyes hollow. I can't believe she would go that far. I wrapped my arms around him, but there was a cold fear in the pit of my stomach. We need to stand our ground, Mike. He nodded slowly, wrapping his arms around me in return. Yeah, we do. That night, we lay in bed, wide awake, knowing that things couldn't go on like this. We had to confront Linda, but the thought of it twisted my guts. She was family, but this was war. A war we never wanted to fight. I watched the sunrise, a routine that brought little comfort these days. Mike was still asleep, the stress of the situation with his mom weighing on him even in his dreams. The idea came to me, a desperate thought that seemed to dance on the edge of sanity. What if Linda believed we were no longer here? Not a permanent deception, just long enough to see her true colors. Over breakfast, I broached the subject with Mike. What if Linda thought we were gone? Not forever, just to see what she'd really do. He nearly choked on his coffee. Gone, as in dead. Exactly, I said. We can tell if her tears are real or just for show. He was silent, the fork halfway to his mouth. "That's intense," he finally said. I nodded. "But necessary." After a moment of heavy silence, Mike agreed. "Let's do it." My mom was the linchpin, her voice a quivering whisper over the phone. "Linda, they had an accident. It's bad. They didn't make it." We huddled in our bedroom, straining to hear through the closed door. Footsteps, then Linda's voice, callous and clear. "So what's in it for me? They must have left something behind." I squeezed Mike's hand so tightly it hurt, shock coursing through us at her blunt words. My mom's voice cracked, playing her part perfectly. "Linda, they just died. Is money all you're thinking about?" "Well, what else am I supposed to think about?" Linda retorted, a scoff hidden in her tone. "I have to take care of myself. They were my support, and now what?" We emerged then, stepping into the living room. Linda's reaction was a mix of horror and disbelief. But the call." Mike was a statue of cold resolve. "You're not getting anything from us, Linda. Not now, not ever again." Her face twisted, anger and shock warring for dominance. "You tricked me." "No," I corrected her, my voice surprisingly steady. "We just showed you the truth." Mike opened the front door, his gesture final. "Goodbye, Linda." As we watched her leave, a part of me mourned the loss of what should have been a family. But we hadn't really lost anything, had we? We'd only uncovered the painful truth that had been there all along. The next few days were eerily quiet. Mike and I rarely spoke about Linda, as if mentioning her might break the calm that had settled over the house. But we couldn't avoid the topic forever. We heard things through friends, little snippets of how Linda was coping. Or rather, not coping. One evening, as we sat on the couch with the TV murmuring in the background, Mike broke the silence. "I heard Mom's selling the house." "Really?" I replied, keeping my eyes on the screen. He nodded. "Yeah, and everything she bought from those shopping sprees." I turned to look at him. "How do you feel about that?" He shrugged. "Relieved, I guess, and sad. It's like I don't even know her." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging between us. Then, a knock at the door. We exchanged a glance, neither of us expecting anyone. Mike got up and I followed, hovering by the hallway as he opened the door. It was Linda, looking smaller somehow. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice void of its usual demand. Mike hesitated but stepped aside. She walked in, not meeting our eyes. I got your mom's message," she started, fiddling with her purse. "We know," Mike said flatly. "I've been selling stuff, trying to make ends meet without asking you for money," Linda continued. Mike crossed his arms. "Why are you telling us this?" Linda looked up then, her eyes wet. "Because I was wrong. And..." She took a breath. "And I'm sorry." It was the first time I'd ever heard those words from her. Mike and I exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between us. "We appreciate the apology, Linda," I said, "but things can't go back to how they were." "I know," she nodded, wiping her eyes. "I know." And with that, she left, closing the door softly behind her. Mike and I returned to the couch, the TV still murmuring away. "Do you think she meant it?" I asked after a moment. "I don't know," Mike replied, "but I hope so, for her sake." We sat there, the room growing dark around us, contemplating the future and what it might bring. It's funny how life has a way of settling down after a storm. Things with Linda quieted down after she left our house that day. Mike and we moved on with our lives, finding peace in the small, daily routines that make up a life together. One evening, after dinner, we were cleaning up when Mike's phone buzzed with a message from an old family friend, Dave. He hesitated for a moment before reading it out loud. "Linda's sold off all her shopping channel hoard. House too. She's in a rental now, over by the east side. I put down the plate I was drying and looked at him. How do you feel about that? He took a deep breath, pondering. Empty, a bit, but also relieved? Relieved, I echoed, not because I was surprised, but because I felt it too. Yeah, she's making her own way, isn't she? Even if it's not what she's used to. He seemed to be trying to convince himself more than me. I nodded, leaning against the counter. Dave say anything else? Mike scrolled through the message. Just that she's telling everyone who'll listen that we've abandoned her, that we're terrible for cutting her off. There was a sting to those words, a sting that might have hurt more once, but not now, not after everything. We haven't abandoned her, Mike. We set boundaries, I said firmly. He looked up, a half smile tugging at his lips. I know, and it's better this way, for all of us. We went back to cleaning up, the house filled with the comfortable silence of two people who understood each other. Later that night, as we settled into bed, Mike turned to me. You know, I don't feel guilty. I found his hand under the covers and squeezed it. You shouldn't. We did more than enough. Yeah, he said softly. We did. We turned off the lights, and in the darkness, I felt the last remnants of tension leave my body. Outside, the world went on, and inside, we had each other. That was enough. Whatever Linda chose to do or say, it was on her now. We had each other, and we had peace. And that's all that really mattered.